Chapter 6. And instinctively, once alone, I made for the places where she had painted her extraordinary pictures. I tried to see what she had seen. Perhaps, now that she had opened my mind to another view, I should be sensitive to some similar interpretation, and possibly by way of literary expression. If I were to write about the place, I asked myself, how should I treat it? I deliberately invited an interpretation in the way that came easiest to me, writing. But in this case, there came no such revelation. Looking closely at the trees and flowers, the bits of lawn and terrace, the rose garden and corner of the house where the flaming creeper hung so thickly, I discovered nothing of the odious, impure thing her color and grouping had unconsciously revealed. At first, that is, I discovered nothing. The reality stood there, commonplace and ugly, side by side with her distorted version of it that lay in my mind. It seemed incredible. I tried to force it, but in vain. My imagination, plowed less deeply than hers, or to another pattern, grew different seed. Where I saw the gross soul of an overgrown suburban garden, inspired by the spirit of a vulgar, rich revivalist who loved to preach damnation, she saw this rush of pagan liberty and joy, the strange license of primitive flesh which, tainted by the other, produced the adulterated, vile result. Certain things, however, gradually then became apparent, forcing themselves upon me willy-nilly. They came slowly, but overwhelmingly. Not that facts had changed, or natural details altered in the grounds, this was impossible, but that I noticed for the first time various aspects I had not noticed before, trivial enough, yet for me, just then significant. Some I remembered from previous days, others I saw now as I wandered to and fro, uneasy, uncomfortable, almost, it seemed, watched by someone who took note of my impressions. The details were so foolish, the total result so formidable. I was half aware that others tried hard to make me see it was deliberate. My sister's phrase, "One layer got at me, another gets at you," flashed undesired upon me. For I saw, as with the eyes of a child, what I can only call a goblin garden. House, grounds, trees, and flowers belonged to a goblin world that children enter through the pages of their fairy tales. And what made me first aware of it was the whisper of the wind behind me, so that I turned with a sudden start, feeling that something had moved closer. An old ash tree, ugly and ungainly, had been artificially trained to form an arbor at one end of the terrace that was a tennis lawn, and the leaves of it now went rustling together, swishing as they rose and fell. I looked at the ash tree, and felt as though I had passed, that moment, between doors into this goblin garden that crouched behind the real one. Below, at a deeper layer perhaps, lay hidden the one my sister had entered. To deal with my own, however, I call it goblin, because an odd aspect of the quaint in it, yet never quite achieved the picturesque. Grotesque, probably, is the truer word, for everywhere I noticed, and for the first time, this slight alteration of the natural, due either to the exaggeration of some detail, or to its suppression, generally, I think, to the latter. Life everywhere appeared to me as blocked from the full delivery of its sweet and lovely message. Some counter-influence stopped it, suppression, or sent it awry, exaggeration. The house itself, mere expression, of course, of a narrow, limited mind, was sheer ugliness. It required no further explanation. With the grounds and garden, so far as shape and a general plan were concerned, this was also true. But that trees and flowers and other natural details should share the same deficiency perplexed my logical soul, and even dismayed it. I stood and stared, then moved about, and stood and stared again. Everywhere was this mockery of a sinister, unfinished aspect. I sought in vain to recover my normal point of view. My mind had found this goblin garden and wandered to and fro in it, unable to escape. The change was in myself, of course, and so trivial were the details which illustrated it that they sound absurd, thus mentioned one by one. For me, they proved it, is all I can affirm. The goblin touch lay plainly everywhere, in the forms of the trees, planted in neat intervals along the lawns, in this twisted ash that rustled just behind me, in the shadow of the gloomy Wellingtonias, whose sweeping skirts obscured the grass, but especially, I noticed, in the tops and crests of them. For here, the delicate, graceful curves of last year's growth seemed to shrink back into themselves. None of them pointed upwards. Their life had failed and turned aside just when it should have become triumphant. The character of a tree reveals itself chiefly at the extremities, and it was precisely here that they all drooped and achieved this hint of goblin distortion, in the growth, that is, of the last few years. What ought to have been fairy, joyful, natural, was instead uncomely to the verge of the grotesque. Spontaneous expression was arrested. My mind perceived a goblin garden and was caught in it. The place grimaced at me. With the flowers it was similar, though far more difficult to detect in detail for description. I saw the smaller vegetable growth as impish, half malicious. Even the terraces sloped ill, as though their ends had sagged since they had been so lavishly constructed. Their varying angles gave a queerly bewildering aspect to their sequence that was unpleasant to the eye. One might wander among their deceptive lengths and get lost among open terraces, with the house quite close at hand. Unhomely seemed the entire garden, unable to give repose, restlessness in it everywhere, almost strife and discord certainly. Moreover, the garden grew into the house into the garden, and in both was this idea of resistance to the natural, the spirit that says no to joy. All over it I was aware of the effort to achieve another end, the struggle to burst forth and escape into free spontaneous expression that should be happy and natural, yet the effort forever frustrated by the weight of this dark shadow that rendered it abortive. Life crawled aside into a channel that was a cul-de-sac, then turned horribly upon itself. Instead of blossom and fruit, there were weeds. This approach of life I was conscious of. Then dismal failure. There was no fulfillment. Nothing happened. And so, through this singular mood, I came a little nearer to understand the impure thing that had stammered out into expression through my sister's talent. For the impure is merely negative. It has no existence. It is but the cramped expression of what is true, stammering its way brokenly over false boundaries that seek to limit and confine. Great full expression of anything is pure, whereas here was only the incomplete, unfinished, and therefore ugly. There was strife and pain and desire to escape. I found myself shrinking from house and grounds, as one shrinks from the touch of the mentally arrested, those in whom life has turned awry. There was almost mutilation in it. Past items, too, now flocked to confirm this feeling that I walked, liberty captured and half maimed, in a monstrous garden. I remembered days of rain that refreshed the countryside, but left these grounds, cracked with the summer heat, unsatisfied and thirsty, and how the big winds that cleaned the woods and fields elsewhere crawled here with difficulty through the dense foliage that protected the towers from the north and west and east. They were ineffective, sluggish currents. There was no real wind. Nothing happened. I began to realize, far more clearly than in my sister's fanciful explanation about layers, that here were many contrary influences at work, mutually destructive of one another. House and grounds were not haunted merely. They were the arena of past thinking and feeling, perhaps of terrible impure beliefs, each striving to suppress the others, yet no one of them achieving supremacy because no one of them was strong enough, no one of them was true. Each, moreover, tried to win me over, though only one was able to reach my mind at all. For some obscure reason, possibly because my temperament had a natural bias towards the grotesque, it was the goblin lair. With me, it was the line of least resistance. In my own thoughts, this goblin garden revealed, of course, merely my personal interpretation. I felt now objectively what long ago my mind had felt subjectively. My work, essential sign of spontaneous life with me, had stopped dead. Production had become impossible. I stood now considerably closer to the cause of this sterility. The cause, rather, turned bolder, had stepped insolently nearer. Nothing happened anywhere. House, garden, minds alike were barren, abortive, torn by the strife of frustrate impulse, ugly, hateful, sinful. Yet behind it all was still the desire of life, desire to escape, accomplish. Hope, an intolerable hope, I became startlingly aware, crowned torture. And, realizing this, though in some part of me where reason lost her hold, there rose upon me then another and a darker thing that caught me by the throat and made me shrink with a sense of revulsion that touched actual loathing. I knew instantly whence it came, this wave of abhorrence and disgust, for even while I saw red and felt revolt rise in me, it seemed that I grew partially aware of the layer next below the goblin. I perceived the existence of this deeper stratum. One opened the way for the other, as it were. There were so many, yet all interrelated. To admit one was to clear the way for all. If I lingered, I should be caught, horribly. They struggled with such violence for supremacy among themselves, however, that this latest uprising was instantly smothered and crushed back, though not before a glimpse had been revealed to me, and the redness in my thoughts transferred itself to color my surroundings thickly and appallingly, with blood. This lurid aspect drenched the garden, smeared the terraces, lent to the very soil a tinge as of sacrificial rites that choked the breath in me, while it seemed to fix me to the earth my feet so longed to leave. It was so revolting that at the same time I felt a dreadful curiosity as of fascination. I wished to stay. Between these contrary impulses, I think I actually reeled a moment, transfixed by a fascination of the awful. Through the lighter goblin veil, I felt myself sinking down, down, down into this turgid layer that was so much more violent and so much more ancient. The upper layer, indeed, seemed fairy by comparison with this terror born of the lust for blood, thick with the anguish of human sacrificial victims. Upper! Then I was already sinking. My feet were caught. I was actually in it. What atavistic strain, hidden deep within me, had been touched into vile response, giving this flash of intuitive comprehension, I cannot say. The coatings laid on by civilization are probably thin enough in all of us. I made a supreme effort. The sun and wind came back. I could almost swear I opened my eyes. Something very atrocious surged back into the depths, carrying with it a thought of tangled woods, of big stones standing in a circle, motionless white figures, the one form bound with ropes, and the ghastly gleam of the knife. Like smoke upon a battlefield, it rolled away. I was standing on the gravel path below the second terrace when the familiar goblin garden danced back again, doubly grotesque now, doubly mocking, yet, by way of contrast, almost welcome. My glimpse into the depths was momentary, it seems, and had passed utterly away. The common world rushed back with a sense of glad relief, yet ominous now, forever, I felt, for the knowledge of what its past had built upon. In street, in theater, in the festivities of friends, in music room or playing field, even indeed in church, how could the memory of what I had seen and felt not leave its hideous trace? The very structure of my thought, it seemed to me, was stained. What had been thought by others can never be obliterated until... With a start, my reverie broke and fled, scattered by a violent sound that I recognized for the first time in my life as wholly desirable. The returning motor meant that my hostess was back. Yet so urgent had been my temporary obsession that my first presentation of her was, well, not as I knew her now. Floating along with the face of anguished torture, I saw Mabel, a mere effigy captured by others' thinking, pass down into those depths of fire and blood that had only just closed beneath my feet. She dipped away. She vanished. Her fading eyes turned to the last, towards some savior who had failed her. And that strange, intolerable hope was in her face. The mystery of the place was pretty thick about me just then. It was the fall of dusk, and the ghost of slanting sunshine was as unreal as though badly painted. The garden stood at attention all about me. I cannot explain it, but I can tell it, I think, exactly as it happened, for it remains vivid in me forever, that, for the first time, something almost happened. Myself apparently the combining link through which it pressed towards delivery. I had already turned towards the house. In my mind were pictures, not actual thoughts, of the motor, tea on the veranda, my sister, Mabel, when there came behind me this tumultuous, awful rush as I left the garden. The ugliness, the pain, the striving to escape, the whole negative and suppressed agony that was the place, focused that second into a concentrated effort to produce a result. It was a blinding tempest of long frustrate desire that heaved at me, surging appallingly behind me like an anguished mob. I was in the act of crossing the frontier into my normal self again, when it came, catching fearfully at my skirts. I might use an entire dictionary of descriptive adjectives, yet come no nearer to it than this: the conception of a huge assemblage determined to escape with me, or to snatch me back among themselves. My legs trembled for an instant, and I caught my breath, then turned and ran as fast as possible up the ugly terraces. At the same instant, as though the clanging of an iron gate cut short the unfinished phrase, I thought the beginning of an awful thing. The damned. Like this, it rushed after me from the goblin garden that had sought to keep me. The damned. For there was sound in it, and I know full well it was subjective, not actually heard at all, yet somehow sound was in it, a great volume, roaring and booming thunderously, far away and below me. The sentence dipped back into the depths that gave it birth, unfinished. Its completion was prevented. As usual, nothing happened. But it drove behind me like a hurricane as I ran towards the house, and the sound of it I can only liken to those terrible undertones you may hear standing beside Niagara. They lie behind the mere crash of the falling flood, within it somehow, not audible to all, felt rather than definitely heard. It seemed to echo back from the surface of those sagging terraces as I flew across their sloping ends, for it was somehow underneath them. It was in the rustle of the wind that stirred the skirts of the drooping Wellingtonias. The beds of formal flowers passed it on to the creepers, red as blood, that crept over the unsightly building. Into the structure of the vulgar and forbidding house it sank away. The towers took it home. The uncomely doors and windows seemed almost like mouths that had uttered the words themselves, and on the upper floors, at that very moment, I saw two maids in the act of closing them again. And on the veranda, as I arrived breathless and shaken in my soul, Frances and Mabel, standing by the tea-table, looked up to greet me. In the faces of both were clearly legible the signs of shock. They watched me coming, yet so full of their own distress that they hardly noticed the state in which I came. In the face of my hostess, however, I read another and a bigger thing than in the face of Frances. Mabel knew. She had experienced what I had experienced. She had heard that awful sentence I had heard, but heard it not for the first time, heard it, moreover, I verily believe, complete and to its dreadful end.
"Bill, did you hear that curious noise just now?"
Frances asked it sharply before I could say a word. Her manner was confused. She looked straight at me, and there was a tremor in her voice she could not hide. "There's wind about," I said. "Wind in the trees, and sweeping round the walls. It's risen rather suddenly." My voice faltered rather.
"No, it wasn't wind,"
she insisted, with a significance meant for me alone, but badly hidden.
"It was more like distant thunder, we thought. And how you ran, too," she added. "What a pace you came across the terraces."
I knew instantly, from the way she said it, that they both had already heard the sound before, and were anxious to know if I had heard it, and how. My interpretation was what they sought. It was a curiously deep sound, I admit. It may have been big guns at sea, I suggested. Forts or cruisers practicing. The coast isn't so very far, and with the wind in the right direction. The expression on Mabel's face stopped me dead.
"Like huge doors closing," she said softly in her colorless voice. "Enormous metal doors, shutting against a mass of people clamoring to get out."
The gravity, the note of hopelessness in her tones, was shocking. Frances had gone into the house the instant Mabel began to speak.
"I'm cold," she had said. "I think I'll get a shawl."
Mabel and I were alone. I believe it was the first time we had been really alone since I arrived. She looked up from the teacups, fixing her pallid eyes on mine. She made a question out of the sentence. "You hear it like that?" I asked innocently. I purposely used the present tense. She changed her stare from one eye to the other. It was absolutely expressionless. My sister's step sounded on the floor of the room behind us.
"If only," Mabel began,
then stopped, and my own feelings leaping out, instinctively completed the sentence I felt was in her mind. Something would happen. She instantly corrected me. I had caught her thought, yet somehow phrased it wrongly.
"We could escape."
She lowered her tone a little, saying it hurriedly. The "we" amazed and horrified me, but something in her voice and manner struck me utterly dumb. There was ice and terror in it. It was a dying woman speaking, a lost and hopeless soul. In that atrocious moment, I hardly noticed what was said exactly, but I remember that my sister returned with a gray shawl about her shoulders, and that Mabel said in her ordinary voice again, "It is chilly, yes. Let's have tea inside," and that two maids, one of them the grenadier, speedily carried the loaded trays into the morning room, and put a match to the logs in the great open fireplace. It was, after all, foolish to risk the sharp evening air, for dusk was falling steadily, and even the sunshine of the day, just fading, could not turn autumn into summer. I was the last to come in. Just as I left the veranda, a large black bird swooped down in front of me past the pillars. It dropped from overhead, swerved abruptly to one side as it caught sight of me, and flapped heavily towards the shrubberies on the left of the terraces, where it disappeared into the gloom. It flew very low, very close, and it startled me, I think, because in some way it seemed like my shadow materialized, as though the dark horror that was rising everywhere from house and garden, then settling back so thickly, yet so imperceptibly upon us all, were incarnated into that whirring creature that passed between the daylight and the coming night. I stood a moment, wondering if it would appear again, before I followed the others indoors, and as I was in the act of closing the windows after me, I caught a glimpse of a figure on the lawn. It was some distance away, on the other side of the shrubberies, in fact, where the bird had vanished. But in spite of the twilight that half magnified, half obscured it, the identity was unmistakable. I knew the housekeeper's stiff walk too well to be deceived. Mrs. Marsh taking the air, I said to myself. I felt the necessity of saying it, and wondered why she was doing so at this particular hour. If I had other thoughts, they were so vague and so quickly and utterly suppressed that I cannot recall them sufficiently to relate them here. And once indoors, it was to be expected that there would come explanation, discussion, conversation, at any rate, regarding the singular noise and its cause, some uttered evidence of the mood that had been strong enough to drive us all inside. Yet there was none. Each of us purposely, and with various skill, ignored it. We talked little, and when we did, it was of anything in the world but that. Personally, I experienced a touch of that same bewilderment which had come over me during my first talk with Frances on the evening of my arrival, for I recall now the acute tension and the hope, yet dread, that one or other of us must sooner or later introduce the subject. It did not happen, however. No reference was made to it, even remotely. It was the presence of Mabel, I felt positive, that prohibited. As soon might we have discussed death in the bedroom of a dying woman. The only scrap of conversation I remember, where all was ordinary and commonplace, was when Mabel spoke casually to the grenadier, asking why Mrs. Marsh had omitted to do something or other, what it was I forget, and that the maid replied respectfully that Mrs. Marsh was very sorry, but her and still pained her. I inquired, though so casually that I scarcely knew what prompted the words, whether she had injured herself severely, and the reply, she upset a lamp and burnt herself, was said in a tone that made me feel my curiosity was indiscreet. But she always has an excuse for not doing things she ought to do. The little bit of conversation remained with me, and I remember particularly the quick way Frances interrupted and turned the talk upon the delinquencies of servants in general, telling incidents of her own at our flat with a volubility that perhaps seemed forced, and that certainly did not encourage general talk as it may have been intended to do. We lapsed into silence immediately she finished. But for all our care and all our calculated silence, each knew that something had, in these last moments, come very close. It had brushed us in passing. It had retired. And I am inclined to think now that the large dark thing I saw, riding the dusk, probably a bird of prey, was in some sense a symbol of it in my mind. That actually there had been no bird at all, I mean, but that my mood of apprehension and dismay had formed the vivid picture in my thoughts. It had swept past us, it had retreated, but it was now, at this moment, in hiding very close, and it was watching us. Perhaps, too, it was mere coincidence that I encountered Mrs. Marsh, his housekeeper, several times that evening in the short interval between tea and dinner, and that on each occasion the sight of this gaunt, half-saturnine woman fed my prejudice against her. Once, on my way to the telephone, I ran into her just where the passage is somewhat jammed by a square table carrying the Chinese gong, a grandfather's clock, and a box of croquet mallets. We both gave way, then both advanced, then again gave way, simultaneously. It seemed impossible to pass. We stepped with decision to the same side, finally colliding in the middle, while saying those futile little things, half apology, half excuse, that are inevitable at such times. In the end, she stood upright against the wall for me to pass, taking her place against the very door I wished to open. It was ludicrous. "Excuse me, I was just going in to telephone," I explained, and she sidled off, murmuring apologies, but opening the door for me while she did so. Our hands met a moment on the handle. There was a second's awkwardness. It was so stupid. I remembered her injury, and by way of something to say, I inquired after it. She thanked me. It was entirely healed now, but it might have been much worse, and there was something about the mercy of the Lord that I didn't quite catch. While telephoning, however, a London call, and my attention focused on it, I realized sharply that this was the first time I had spoken with her, also that I had touched her. It happened to be a Sunday, and the lines were clear. I got my connection quickly, and the incident was forgotten while my thoughts went up to London. On my way upstairs, then, the woman came back into my mind, so that I recalled other things about her, how she seemed all over the house, in unlikely places often, how I had caught her sitting in the hall alone that night, how she was forever coming and going with her lugubrious visage and that untidy hair at the back that had made me laugh 3 years ago with the idea that it looked singed or burnt, and how the impression on my first arrival at the Towers was that this woman somehow kept alive, though its evidence was outwardly suppressed, the influence of her late employer and of his somber teachings. Somewhere with her was associated the idea of punishment, vindictiveness, revenge. I remembered again, suddenly, my odd notion that she sought to keep her present mistress here, a prisoner in this bleak and comfortless house, and that really, in spite of her obsequious silence, she was intensely opposed to the change of thought that had reclaimed Mabel to a happier view of life. All this in a passing second flashed in review before me, and I discovered, or at any rate reconstructed, the real Mrs. Marsh. She was decidedly in the shadow. More, she stood in the forefront of it, stealthily leading an assault, as it were, against the Towers and its occupants, as though, consciously or unconsciously, she labored incessantly to this hateful end. I can only judge that some state of nervousness in me permitted the series of insignificant thoughts to assume this dramatic shape, and that what had gone before prepared the way and led her up at the head of so formidable a procession. I relate it exactly as it came to me. My nerves were doubtless somewhat on edge by now, otherwise I should hardly have been a prey to the exaggeration at all. It seemed open to so many strange impressions. Nothing else, perhaps, can explain my ridiculous conversation with her, when, for the third time that evening, I came suddenly upon the woman halfway down the stairs, standing by an open window, as if in the act of listening. She was dressed in black, a black shawl over her square shoulders, and black gloves on her big broad hands. 2 black objects, prayer books apparently, she clasped, and on her head she wore a bonnet with shaking beads of jet. At first I did not know her, as I came running down upon her from the landing. It was only when she stood aside to let me pass that I saw her profile against the tapestry and recognized Mrs. Marsh. And to catch her on the front stairs, dressed like this, struck me as incongruous, impertinent. I paused in my dangerous descent. Through the opened window came the sound of bells, church bells, a sound more depressing to me than superstition and as nauseating. Though the action was ill-judged, I obeyed the sudden prompting. Was it a secret desire to attack, perhaps? And spoke to her. "Been to church, I suppose, Mrs. Marsh," I said, "or just going, perhaps?" Her face, as she looked up a second to reply, was like an iron doll that moved its lips and turned its eyes, but made no other imitation of life at all. "Some of us still goes, sir," she said unctuously. It was respectful enough, yet the implied judgment of the rest of the world made me almost angry. A deferential insolence lay behind the affected meekness. "For those who believe, no doubt it is helpful," I smiled. "True religion brings peace and happiness, I'm sure. Joy, Mrs. Marsh, joy!" I found keen satisfaction in the emphasis. She looked at me like a knife. I cannot describe the implacable thing that shone in her fixed, stern eyes, nor the shadow of felt darkness that stole across her face. She glittered. I felt hate in her. I knew, she knew too, who was in the thoughts of us both at that moment. She replied softly, never forgetting her place for an instant. "There is joy, sir, in heaven, over one sinner that repenteth, and in church there goes up prayer to God for those for the others, sir, who—" She cut short her sentence thus. The gloom about her, as she said it, was like the gloom about a hearse, a tomb, a darkness of great hopeless dungeons. My tongue ran on of itself with a kind of bitter satisfaction. "We must believe there are no others, Mrs. Marsh. Salvation, you know, would be such a failure if there were. No merciful, all-foreseeing God could ever have devised such a fearful plan." Her voice interrupting me seemed to rise out of the bowels of the earth. "They rejected the salvation when it was offered to them, sir, on earth." "But you wouldn't have them tortured forever because of one mistake in ignorance," I said, fixing her with my eye. "Come now, would you, Mrs. Marsh? No God worth worshipping would permit such cruelty. Think a moment what it means." She stared at me, a curious expression in her stupid eyes. It seemed to me as though the woman in her revolted, while yet she dared not suffer her grim belief to trip. That is, she would willingly have had it otherwise, but for a terror that prevented. "We may pray for them, sir, and we do. We may hope." She dropped her eyes to the carpet. "Good, good," I put in cheerfully, sorry now that I had spoken at all. "That's more hopeful at any rate, isn't it?" She murmured something about Abraham's bosom, and the time of salvation not being forever, as I tried to pass her. Then a half gesture that she made stopped me. There was something more she wished to say, to ask. She looked up furtively. In her eyes I saw the woman peering out through fear. "Perhaps, sir," she faltered, as though lightning must strike her dead. "Perhaps, would you think a drop of cold water, given in his name, might moisten—" But I stopped her, for foolish talk had lasted long enough. "Of course," I exclaimed, "of course. For God is love, remember, and love means charity, tolerance, sympathy, and sparing others pain." And I hurried past her, determined to end the outrageous conversation for which yet I knew myself entirely to blame. Behind me she stood stock still for several minutes, half bewildered, half alarmed, as I suspected. I caught the fragment of another sentence, one word of it, rather, punishment, but the rest escaped me. Her arrogance and condescending tolerance exasperated me, while I was at the same time secretly pleased that I might have touched some string of remorse or sympathy in her after all. Her belief was iron. She dared not let it go, yet somewhere underneath there lurked the germ of a wholesome revulsion. She would help them if she dared. Her question proved it. Half ashamed of myself, I turned and crossed the hall quickly, lest I should be tempted to say more, and in me was a disagreeable sensation, as though I had just left the incurable ward of some great hospital. A reaction caught me as of nausea. Ah, I wanted such people cleansed by fire. They seemed to me as centers of contamination whose vicious thoughts flowed out to stain God's glorious world. I saw myself, Francis, Mabel too especially, on the rack, while that odious figure of cruelty and darkness stood over us and ordered the awful handles turned in order that we might be saved. Forced, that is, to think and believe exactly as she thought and believed. I found relief from my somewhat childish indignation by letting myself loose upon the organ, then. The flood of Bach and Beethoven brought back the sense of proportion. It proved, however, at the same time, that there had been this growth of distortion in me, and that it had been provided apparently by my closer contact, for the first time, with that funereal personality, the woman who, like her master, believed that all holding views of God that differed from her own must be damned eternally. It gave me, moreover, some faint clue, perhaps, though a clue I was unequal to following up, to the nature of the strife and terror and frustrate influence in the house. That housekeeper had to do with it. She kept it alive. Her thought was like a spell she waved above her mistress's head.